Good morning, I'm Teacher Rose, and welcome to Introduction to the Philosophy of the Human Person. For today's presentation, I'm going to present the first part of methods of philosophizing. For our most essential learning competencies, it is to distinguish opinion from truth and to realize that the methods of philosophy led to wisdom and truth. For the specific objectives, number 1, identify the meaning, importance, and source of knowledge. Number 2, describe the steps, processes of acquiring knowledge. Number 3, explain how validating one's knowledge leads to truth. And number 4, compare or contrast different theories of truth. Have you ever experienced believing in something you thought is true, but in the end you discover that it is false? For example, you feel that the person standing in front of you is a true friend who will never betray you, but in the end, he did betray you. Or during an examination period, you feel strongly that A is the right answer for item number 12, but it turned out to be B. Or you feel that your belief or beliefs can guide you in the correct path only to discover that it leads to disaster. These and countless examples from your experiences show that there is a big difference to what we feel is true and what is really true. According to philosophy, if you want to know the truth, you have to use not emotions but thinking. To think, however, is an act of choice which is not always done properly. Sometimes we need guidance to strengthen our thoughts. And this is the content of our presentation. Welcome to the province of epistemology. For our question, what is epistemology? There is one correct definition of epistemology. The one that I'm going to use came from the philosopher Ayn Rand. Epistemology is a science devoted to the discovery of the proper method of acquiring and validating knowledge. The purpose of epistemology, therefore, is twofold: to show how we can acquire knowledge, and number 2, to give us method of demonstrating whether the knowledge we acquired is really knowledge or truth. Since knowledge plays a central role in epistemology, let us briefly describe its nature. According to Ayn Rand, knowledge is a mental grasp of reality reached either by perceptual observation or by a process of reason based on perceptual observation. When you know something, like be it the behavior of your friend, the movement of planets, or the origin of civilizations, you understand its nature. You identify what it is, and it stays with you. So knowledge is a retained form of awareness. So how do you acquire knowledge? Ms. Rand's definition gives us two ways. First, we can acquire knowledge using our senses: seeing, hearing, tasting, feeling, and smelling. For example, how do you know that the table is brown? Because you see it. How do you know that the fire is hot? Because you feel it. So this method of acquiring knowledge is called empiricism. Second, We can acquire knowledge by thinking with the use of our minds, what philosophers call the rational faculty. This is what rationalism advocates. However, thinking is just a half of the story of knowing. The reason is that thinking involves content. To think is to think of something. You cannot think about nothing. This is where sense perception enters the picture by feeding our minds with data coming from the outside world so that we can have something to think about. So let us now explore the first part of epistemology, the process of acquiring knowledge. And these are number 1, reality, number 2, perception, number 3, concept, number 4, proposition, and number 5 is inference. So let's start with number 1. Number 1 is reality. To know is to know something. This something is what philosophers call reality, existence, being. So let us employ the term existence. Existence is everything there is, or another name for it is the universe. It includes everything we perceive, like animals, plants, human beings, inanimate objects, and everything inside our heads, our thoughts and emotions, which represent our inner world. Existence is really all there is to know. If nothing exists, knowledge is impossible. Number 2 is perception. Our first and only contact with reality is through our senses. Knowledge begins with perceptual knowledge. At first, the senses give us knowledge of things or entities, what Aristotle calls primary substance: dog, cat, chair, table, and man. Later, we became aware not only of things but certain aspects of things like qualities. Can be blue, hard, or smooth. Quantities, 7 inches or 6 pounds. Relationship, in front of, son of, and even actions, jumping, running, lying. These so-called Aristotelian categories cannot be separated from the entities that have it. Red, for example, cannot be separated from red objects. Walking cannot be separated from the person that walks. Number 3 is concept. After we perceive things, we begin to notice that some of the things we perceive are similar to other things. For example, we see 3 individuals, let's call them Juan, Pablo, and Pedro, who may have nothing in common at first glance. But when we compare them with another entity, a dog for example, suddenly their difference becomes insignificant. Their big difference to a dog highlights their similarity to one another. We therefore group them into one class or group, name the group man or human being, and define what the group is to give it identity. We now have a concept which according to one dictionary means an abstract or generic idea generalized from particular instances. The first concept we form are concepts of things like dog, cat, man, house, or car. These elementary concepts are called first-level concepts. From this level concept, we can form higher-level concepts through a process which Rand calls abstractions from abstractions. Let us describe the two types of abstraction from abstractions: wider generalizations or simply widenings, and subdivisions or narrowings. Wider generalization is the process of forming wider and wider concepts. For example, from Juan, Pedro, and Pablo, we can form the concept man. Then from man, dog, cat, and monkey, we can form a higher and wider concept, animal. And from plant and animal, we can form a still higher and wider concept, living organism. As we go up to this progressive widening, our knowledge increases. Subdivision consists of identifying finer and finer distinctions. For example, man is the first level concept that we can subdivide according to expression, or race, or gender, or nationality, or among other things. As we go down these progressive narrowings, our knowledge of things subsumed under a concept increases. The result of these progressive widenings and narrowings is a hierarchy of concepts whose base is sense perception. As we move further from the perceptual-based, knowledge becomes more abstract. As we move closer to the perceptual level, knowledge becomes more concrete. Number 4 is proposition. So when we use concepts in order to classify or describe an existent, we use what philosophers call a proposition. A proposition is a statement that expresses either an assertion or a denial that an existence belongs to a class or possess certain attribute. Proposition is usually expressed in a declarative sentence. When I say, for example, that men are mortals, I am making an assertion of men which are affirmative in nature. So thus the statement is an affirmative proposition. When I make an opposite claim, however, men are not mortals, I am denying something about men, and thus my statement is negative in nature. Thus, the proposition is called a negative proposition. An affirmative proposition, therefore, has the following structure. S is P, where S is the subject, E is the predicate, and is the copula stating the logical relationship of S and E. While the negative proposition that has a structure S is not P, is not is the copula expressing denial. Notice that statements like men are mortals, angels are not demons, and saints are not sinners can either be true or false. Truth and falsity are called the two possible truth values of the statement. Number 5 is inference. How do we demonstrate that the statement is true? By providing an argument. According to Harley, an argument is a group of statements, one or more of which the premises are claimed to provide support for, or reason to believe one of the others, the conclusion. To clarify this definition, let's give an example using the famous Socratic argument. All men are mortals. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Here we have three related statements or propositions. The last statement beginning with the word therefore is what we call a conclusion. A conclusion is a statement that we want to prove. The first two statements are what we call premises, singular form premise. A premise provides justification, evidence, and proof to the conclusion. An argument expresses a reasoning process, which logicians call inference. Arguments, however, is not the only form of inference, but logicians usually use argument and inference interchangeably. There are still many things to be discussed on the topic of knowledge acquisition. We only provide a brief overview of the topic. Now that we know how we know, it's time to see whether the knowledge we acquire is really knowledge or truth. This is the second part of epistemology, validating one's knowledge. The first step in validating one's knowledge is to ask oneself the following question. How did I arrive at this belief? But what steps? Dash, you have to retrace the step you took to acquire knowledge, or what we call reverse engineer the process. This is what Dr. Fico calls reduction. One will therefore realize that the steps you took to acquire knowledge are the same steps needed to validate knowledge, but in reverse order. Thus, what the ancient pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus said is true when applied to epistemology. The way up knowledge acquisition is the way down knowledge validation. If we perform the process of reduction, we will realize that all true knowledge rests ultimately on sense perception. A belief is true if it can be justified or proven through the use of one's senses. Consider the following statement. I am alive, I have a body, I can breathe. You can only validate the above statement if you observe yourself using your senses. Feel your body. Are you breathing? Feel your pulse. Observe your body. Is it moving? These and countless examples provided by your senses prove that you're alive. Not all statements, however, can be validated directly by the senses. Some beliefs or ideas need a multi-step process of validation called proof. Nevertheless, proof rests ultimately on sense perception. Statements based on sense perception are factual, and if we base our beliefs on such facts, our beliefs are true. For example, the belief that human beings have the right to life rests on the following claim. Human beings are rational animals. Number 2. Animals, including human beings, are living organisms. And of course, the fact that we are alive can be demonstrated perceptually as shown above. A third way to determine if the statement is through a consensus. If the majority agrees that the statement is true, then it is true. However, there are certain limitations to this approach. For too many times in history, false ideas became popular, which ultimately leads to disaster. For example, the vast majority of Germans during the time of Adolf Hitler believed that Jews are racially inferior. This is obviously false, supported by a pseudo-biological science of the Nazi. The result of this false consensus is the extermination of millions of Jews in many parts of Europe. A fourth way to determine whether a statement is true is to test it by means of action. For example, you want to know if a person is friendly. Well, the best way to find out is to approach the person. Thus, the famous Nike injunction of just do it is applicable in this situation. Next is truth versus opinion. Identifying truth, however, can sometimes be tricky. The reason is that there are times when we strongly held an idea that we feel deep down to be true. For example, religious people strongly believe that there is life after death. Some people who embrace democracy may passionately embrace the idea that the majority is always right. Or on a more personal level, you may feel strongly that your sister is selfish. However, we must not confuse strongly held beliefs with truth. Truth is knowledge validated, and when we say validated, we mean they are based on the facts of reality. We must understand that the facts of reality are independent of our thoughts, feelings, or preferences. That is the characteristic of truth. For example, the statement, Rosalinda died in 1896 is true. We may not like the statement or deny it strongly. That does not change the fact that the statement is true because it is based on what really happened in the past. There are many sources that can validate the truth of that statement if one cared to look. However, when you say that Rosalinda is the greatest man who ever lived, you are stating your preference and not facts. This is an opinion. Now, it is true that there are many facts about Rizal, but that statement is asserting something that is beyond what the facts state. That statement represents not facts but your interpretation of facts, which may reveal your biases. To summarize, an opinion has the following characteristics. Number 1, based on emotion. Number 2, open to interpretation. Number 3, cannot be confirmed. And number 4, inherently biased. While truth is number 1, based on the facts of reality. Number 2, can be confirmed with other sources. Number 3, independent of one's interpretation, preference, and biases. And for our last presentation is about the theories of truth. In knowing the truth or falsity of a statement, we generally use the following theories of truth. Number 1 is the correspondence theory of truth. The basic idea of the correspondence theory is that what we believe or say is true if it corresponds to the way things actually are based on the facts. It argues that an idea that corresponds with reality is true, while an idea which does not correspond to reality is false. For example, if I say the sky is blue, then I look outside and saw that it is indeed blue, then my statement is true. On the other hand, if I say figs have wings, and then I check a fig and it does not have wings, then my statement is false. In general statements and of beliefs, propositions and ideas are capable of being true or false. However, according to Leeds, a student of the Megara School of Philosophy, the correspondence theory of truth leaves us in the lurch when we are confronted with a statement such as, I am lying, or what I am saying here is false. These are statements and therefore are capable of being true or false. But if they are true because they correspond with reality, then any preceding statement or proposition must be false. Conversely, if these statements are false because they do not agree with reality, then any preceding statement or proposition must be true. Thus, no matter what we say about the truth or falsehood of this statement, we immediately contradict ourselves. This does mean that the correspondence theory of truth is wrong or useless, and to be perfectly honest, it is difficult to give up such an intuitively obvious idea that truth must match reality. Nevertheless, the above criticisms should indicate that it probably is not a comprehensive explanation of the nature of truth. Arguably, it is a fair description of what truth should be, but it may not be an adequate description of how truth actually works in human minds and social situations. Austin Klein argues, it is important to note here that truth is not a property of facts. This may seem odd at first, but a distinction must be made between facts and beliefs. A fact is some set of circumstances in the world, while a belief is an opinion about what those facts are. A fact cannot be either true or false because it's simply the way the world is. A belief, however, is capable of being true or false because it may or may not accurately describe the world. Number 2 is the coherence theory of truth. It has already been established that the correspondence theory assumes that a belief is true when we are able to confirm it with reality. In other words, by simply checking if the statement or beliefs agrees with the way things really are, we can know the truth. However, as Austin Klein argues, this manner of determining the truth is rather odd and simplistic. Klein said that a belief can be an accurate description of reality that may also fit in with a larger, complex system of further inaccurate descriptions of reality. Thus, by relying on the correspondence theory, that inaccurate belief will still be called truth even though it does not actually describe actual state of things. So how do we resolve this problem? In order to know the truth of a statement, it must be tested as part of a larger set of ideas. The statement cannot be sufficiently evaluated in isolation. For example, if you pick up a ball and drop it accidentally, the action cannot be simply explained by our beliefs in the law of gravity, which can be verified, but also by a host of other factors that may have something to do with the incident, such as the accuracy of our visual perception. For Klein, only when statements are tested as part of a larger system of complex ideas, then one might conclude that the statement is true. By testing this set of complex ideas against reality, then one can ascertain whether the statement is true or false. Consequently, by using this method, we establish that the statement coheres with the larger system. In a sense, the coherence theory is similar to the correspondence theory, since both evaluate statements based on their agreement with reality. The difference lies in the method when the former involves a larger system, while the latter relies on a single evidence of fact. As a result, coherent theories have often rejected or lacking justification in their application to other areas of truth, especially in statements or claims about the natural world. empirical data in general and assertion about practical matters of psychology and society, especially when they are used without support from the other major theories of truth. Number 3 is the pragmatist theory of truth. The pragmatic theory of truth states that a belief statement is true if it has a useful or pragmatic application in the world. If it does not, then it is not true. In addition, we can know whether a belief statement is true by examining the consequence of holding or accepting the statement believed to be true. For example, there are some people who think that there are ghosts or vampires because they find it useful in explaining unusual phenomena and in dealing with fears. So, if we're going to use the word truth, we define it as that which is most useful to us. However, there are objections against this theory of truth. For Austin Klein, truth that is based on what works is very ambiguous. What happens when a belief works in one sense but fails in another? Suppose a belief that one will succeed may give a person the psychological strength needed to accomplish a great deal, but in the end, he failed his ultimate goal. Was his belief true? In this sense, Klein argues that when a belief works, it is more appropriate to call it useful rather than true. A belief that is useful is not necessarily true, and in normal conversations, people do not typically use the word true to mean useful. To illustrate the statement, it is useful to believe that my spouse is faithful does not all mean the same as it is true that my spouse is faithful. Granted that true beliefs are also usually the ones that are useful, but it is not usually the case. In sum, we can know if statement beliefs are true if we look at each statement belief and determine if they correspond to facts cohere with the rules of the system and result into useful application. It must be noted, however, that philosophers continue to argue with each other on which among these three general methods is the correct one or one that works for all kinds of statements or beliefs. Nevertheless, it is not necessary to subscribe to only one method and consider it to work for everyone. Perhaps it is better to use any of the three methods that is appropriate for any given statement or belief that is being examined. And that's all for today's presentation. Again, I'm Teacher Rose saying share love to everybody, be a blessing to everyone. Thank you.